You are now entering Nick and Mello's Hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and my favorite family in all of Star Wars is the Ghost Crew from Star Wars Rebels.
And I'm Carmelo, and he just cheated. My favorite family is Star Wars Rebels. I love that group.
In our journeys through hyperspace, we're going to examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one a little bit older, who will come together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about family. And one of the things that I love about this idea of family in Star Wars is that there are different kinds of families in Star Wars. They're not exactly the same, and they sort of work, they come in different configurations. And the first thing that I wanted to talk with you about, Nick, is this notion that we have biological families. We have families that are sort of connected by their own biology, by their sort of being offsprings of others. But then there are other families that I would call families, but are not biologically connected at all. And let's talk about, we can start with the Rebels crew, that it is, we see the formation of that family and the emotional and sort of force links that exist with this family. And they might not be biologically a family, but for me, they are a family. They are almost like a traditional family in the way that we think of family today.
Yeah, it's interesting. We both said that that's our favorite family in Star Wars. They really grow on you, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think we see that a lot through Star Wars, how characters from various backgrounds and situations come together, obviously for story reasons, but they come together and they form a bond, and they go through journeys and adventures together that really bring them together. And yeah, I would say that even like the Rebels family is maybe stronger than some biological families that we see. Bond and the connection they've built. And it's really fascinating to see that the message, I guess, I get from a lot of that is that just because you're biologically related to someone doesn't necessarily mean they're your family, that anyone can kind of be your family through experience.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting. I find it fascinating that both you and I are connecting so much with a group of people that we could just say they're friends, mm-hmm. but they're more than friends. And so it's I love the notion, Star Wars has this sort of tradition of being a narrative that it is somewhat geared towards the younger audiences. And so the idea of family is sort of a natural topic in here. But Star Wars is not advocating for this idea that, your blood relatives are necessarily your family. And that you can create family links, family connections, without necessarily having that blood relation, that blood connection. And I find that really interesting. That I think of Hera as a mom, mm-hmm. even though she eventually becomes a mom at the very end of season 4.
Right.
She's been a mom for 4 seasons.
Yeah. We had a lot of practice.
Yes. And so it's really interesting that it's interesting on the one hand that they have to make her a biological mother at the end. That's a different story. But it is interesting that we have been thinking of her as a maternal figure. Something that I say in my book on Star Wars, that Hera is the goddess of fertility and maternity in the Greek gods. And so that mm-hmm. name already is sort of telling you that this is a maternal figure. And so that I find really intriguing. Now, you mentioned to me in the past that there are other sort of non-biological families, and I'd love to talk to you about the video game that you were telling me about, in which there is once again a non-biological family. And since I am old and I don't play video games, I would love to be educated on this.
Yeah. Those.
And I want to tell the audience that this is like real. I know nothing about video games, and Nick is going to educate me on this.
So I'm not a big gamer, but Star Wars is probably my favorite thing in the world. So of course I was playing this game any way I could. So yeah, it came out 2019, and the story, just a brief summary, is the main character is a former Padawan who goes into hiding after Order 66, and then he gets kind of sprung back into the action through a mistake, as you will. He had to save a friend, and of course he got found out by the Imperial Security Bureau. And anyway, he kind of goes on the run and tries to rebuild the Jedi Order in a way.
Okay.
And he runs into other characters. He runs into another former Padawan, but she left before Order 66, and it was a complicated and traumatic past she had. And she has a partner who is hilarious. His name is Grease. I'm not sure what his species is, but he reminds me of a fun-loving uncle.
Okay.
And they meet a Night Sister too, who becomes part of the family.
Oh wow!
She's the last of the Night Sisters, and
okay.
They go to Dathomir and they connect. And then there's a little droid, BD1. He's kind of, the, I don't want to say pet, but kind of the pet of the family, and they just kind of form a bond over the game. And they all come from a traumatic past and had to witness horrific things due to the Empire taking over, and they all kind of come together and try to, make things better for not themselves, but the next generation and the coming generations. And
right.
There's only one installment of the game right now, so we don't really know where their story is going to go.
Okay.
But yeah, the reason I wore the shirt is it reminded me of Rebels and other times in Star Wars where we see people just come together due to circumstance, and they didn't really plan to become a family, or it just happened that way,
Right. And that seems to happen a lot in Star Wars. I mean, there's when I've been reading the new series of the Star Wars comics that started in 2015, sort of what happens between the end of New Hope and the beginning of Empire, those sort of like 75 issues. And it's really interesting how the Rebel Alliance is slowly becoming a family. Mm-hmm. How all of these sort of characters are slowly sort of linking themselves. And so there are probably more examples, but it seems to be a trend in Star Wars that the non-biological family is never seen as lesser than a biological family, and that I find really, 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 really interesting. I love that connection. And let's not forget that Disney and Lucasfilm are both very much interested in family. So this is family in a way, sort of like one of the things that brings Disney and Lucasfilm together. Whether people like that or not, it's just sort of part of the nature of both narratives that are the notion of family is very much connected to it. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I was going to say, Star Wars is always a coming of age story, regardless of the generation or the era we're in. And I think in every generation, you do see a core of characters who always don't, like we said earlier, don't start out or don't expect to be close, and they end up being the best of friends and spend many years together. And it's always fascinating. And I think that just kind of shows Star Wars, like we said, is intended for a younger audience. And I think that's just a way of speaking to a younger audience that you're going to meet people in life. You don't expect to be close to them, but they pretty much could be your family at some point. And you're going to go through some things together. And I think that's a universal message that everybody can relate to.
I like that very much. I think it's a beautiful way of creating an affective or an emotional bond with others. And I like that Star Wars is legitimizing that connection in a very real way. Talking about biological families, I was really intrigued that we get a lot of families, like biological families, that it's like mother and daughter, father and son, like Sabine Wren and her mother, or Hera and her father, or even I guess with the Skywalkers we get Padme and Anakin, and we get Luke and Leia. So that's a more traditional family. But there are lots of families that we don't get the sort of extended family, but we get this sort of like one line of the family. And so biological families do exist in Star Wars. But we never get like the whole thing. We just get like these sort of discrete lines in Star Wars. And I don't know what to make of it. I don't think I have anything intelligent to say about it, but it's sort of an observation that I have noticed as I have watched the television shows and the movies and reading the novels and all of that. big families don't really exist very much. It's very much the nuclear family.
Yeah, and I was gonna say the the Skywalker family reunions probably are very boring because there's not much going on. There's only a couple. There's yeah, and I think a lot of times we will see families they're kind of resistant at first. We see a lot of characters that become either they have a bad history with their family, or they had some kind of accident or tragedy happen that just kind of took away a family that they had, and they don't want to replace that old family, and they think they're kind of dishonoring what came before them. And at the same time, it relates to another podcast we talked about, legacy, and it will, they're kind of creating their own new legacy with this new family, even if they don't have a last name or a group name that kind of connects them through.
It's not that Star Wars is negating or rejecting the traditional biological family. It's that Star Wars is recognizing that there are familial bonds that exist outside the biological. And so Sabine Wren can still sort of reconnect with her clan without necessarily breaking the bonds that the Ghost crew has created through their own history. And so it's interesting that you sort of have them both working in different ways. But I like very much what you're saying, that the biological families in Star Wars, there's always conflict. There's always a generational conflict. Starting with the Skywalkers. And so there's this really clear notion that biological family, there's going to be some sort of tension. There's some sort of tension. Can I throw something at you?
Sure.
What about Mandalorian clans?
Yes.
Do you think of them as families?
Yeah, they're a little different, I guess you would say, than obviously seems like all Star Wars families are a little different than ours that we know in our world. But yeah, they especially with the Mandalorian, we've seen a little more into their and now they are a cult, so they are obviously different than the Mandalorians we see in Rebels or in Clone Wars. But yeah, we see a kind of an indoctrine of this way of life, and they bring in these foundlings, and they kind of expect them just to adapt to what the Mandalorians have done and how they operate. And I guess we haven't really seen anyone kind of try to buck that trend or try to be I guess question it, and then they just go with it, I guess. And I guess in a way they are, like Din Djarin, in a way he is very like grateful and thankful for the Mandalorians that saved him, and I guess in his way he's honoring them. And so it's a fascinating sector of the galaxy.
Yeah, and it's tricky. The more I think about it, the more complicated it gets, because when you get the sort of, let's call them the old-fashioned clans in Mandalore itself, they are families in a way, on a very strict code, and they're it's like a combination between a community and a family, but they're very tight knit. But what I find really interesting about the Mandalorian is, when you get the clan of two, there's no biological connection between Grogu and Din, but they're a clan. And so once again, Star Wars is constantly reconfiguring what family means. And it even does it when we talk about the clans, because the way that the Rebel family is created is very different from the way a clan would be created in Mandalore. But they both function, I feel, socially as families.
Yeah.
They have the same sort of strong connections in a way that they are different, but they are connected by this sort of idea of family. And so that's yet another way of thinking of family in Star Wars.
Yeah, and glad we brought up the Mandalorians and the Mandalorian series in general, because I think that's just the core of the show, is the relationship between Din and Grogu, and that carries the weight of the show, and it's the main. I think it carries the franchise in a lot of ways, because we are interested in why these people keep screwing up and they keep messing things up, and We want them to be happy. We want everybody to have a happy ending, and we we see that often. Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it.
I remember during the first season of The Mandalorian, there were all of these websites about um, sort of all the parental mistakes that Mando is making with Grogu. Sort of like, yeah, you're a father figure, but you're a pretty messed up father figure right
Yeah,
now. And it's sort of really nice to see the process of him needing to become a paternal figure.
yeah,
Without his, because he's very reluctant at the beginning, and then the more he's with Grogu, the more he develops that effective bond with him, and he's in a way a much better father in season 2 than he is in season 1. And once again, here's another linear family, sort of like it's just father and son.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not biological, it sort of feels like a father and son story. And so that's another thing. Go ahead.
I'd like to make a connection actually. When you were talking like that, it made me think of Kylo Ren and Ben Solo a lot.
So, yeah, that's a tough one.
That's a complicated one. Well, you know how you just said after the first season, people were questioning his parenting and is he really nurturing? And we see that I think a lot in Mandalorian, where he does the Force joke on Cara Dune, and he kind of, I think there's a reflection. He's seeing violence all around him, so he thinks it's normalized. And I think, and I want to make a connection with Ben Solo and some of the expanded material, like the comics and the novels. They've the book Bloodline is when the galaxy finds out that Vader is Leia's biological father, and from what I can tell, that is Ben Solo's first knowledge of it as well. And the comics we see in the Rise of Kylo Ren, he's living up to this legacy of his father and Luke and all that came before him. And he didn't really ask for any of this. And, he goes off with Luke to do his training. And we've mentioned before, the Jedi are not really a particular family unit. They're more of in a way, a lot of like a cult and a monk mentality. And we don't really see Ben Solo nurtured like that, like he should be. And like other characters are in Star Wars, and that probably leads ultimately to his downfall. And I think that's just a fun connection I just made with Din
and it's I'm glad you brought Ben into the conversation, because it is one of the few places where we get a sort of father-son and then a mother-son relation. Mm-hmm. And you talked about Claudia Gray's novel, in which she is sort of the weight of Vader as her father is something that we don't get a lot in the original trilogy. And I love how Claudia Gray sort of brings the weight of that legacy of being the daughter of Darth Vader. And so it's really interesting to see in the sequel trilogy, Ben in conflict and in relation to both his father and his mother. And then in Bloodlines, we get that connection of, my dead father is Vader with Leia herself. And so once again, the biological connection is always a very complex one.
Yeah.
And is one sort of wrought with conflict and tension in very real ways. This is a really fascinating thing that it just keeps going on and on and on and on. I just looked at my little painting of Boba Fett in the wall. We could talk about Jango and Boba.
Yeah.
And there's another one line of sort of father and son. They're just everywhere. They really are everywhere. It's just like you keep thinking and thinking and thinking, and they keep popping up. They keep popping up.
It's a family soap opera. It's a giant space family soap opera. That's all it is. We're watching these conflicts all over. And,
yeah.
You brought up Boba. I'll be curious to see how they handle him in the future with comics coming out. He's being more involved with that material, and then of course he's getting the book of Boba Fett. So we'll see how he kind of lives with his father's legacy and how that will play. And the clones, it made me think of the clones too. That's another podcast. Yeah,
another podcast. We can't go there because we're going to be here for the next 3 hours.
I could talk about the clones all day. I love them.
I have one more. I have a question that just popped up in my head when we were talking about Boba.
Okay.
Can you think, and this is an honest question, can you think of these kind of familial links, non-biological familial links, in sort of the bounty hunters world?
Well, you have the Hutts. They're very much a family.
Of course.
And I can't really
never
of any
think about
other-
the Hutts.
Yeah,
I
and
never
the
do.
Hutts are
Yeah, they're a
interesting,
clan and a family.
which is weird because I think they might be the most stable family in all the galaxy because they've been for generations, and we see them, relative to Jabba in the Clone Wars, and even in the High Republic. We've
Good for you.
some-
You get $500 for that one. That's very interesting. I had not thought about that, but that's very real.
Yeah, we see, like I mentioned, we see them in the High Republic, the Hutts. We don't know if Jabba is around, but we see other Hutts, and I just assume they're related. I don't know if it's a species or biologically, but I just assume they're related because why not? So it'll be interesting.
No. I had not thought about them, but they are yet another family. They are yet another family in very real ways. And I think the Clone Wars movie, that sort of the pilot is, it's Jabba's son, right? That gets kidnapped.
So? I believe it is.
Ooh.
Yeah,
and now all the fans are going to stop watching our podcast because we didn't know that
we didn't get something
information. Right. We are done. No more podcast for you guys.
We'll be okay.
All right. Well, this was fun. This was really interesting.
This is a very detailed topic.
All of these layers that happen. So, wow. And you seem to be like in the light of the Force. You have like all this halo around you with the wonderful light in your room. That's pretty awesome. It's a good way of ending it. So, thank you, Nick. Thank you, audience. Have a wonderful life. We'll see you soon. There will be more. Be more. Take care.